Today we're going to be doing an all-grain version of a porter, actually a colonial porter with some changes. So, if you can tell, it's dark like a stout, but nutty, not very heavy, doesn't have any of the roasted burning flavors that you would get from a stout, but also a lot more flavor than a typical ale. And incidentally, this is the ale that pretty much started the revolution. George Washington is known, as well as other founding fathers, to drink hundreds of cases before, during, and after the Revolution. It was a modification of what the Brits did. So to start, we're going to need several ingredients. Our grains, and in this case it's about 9.5 pounds of regular pale malt, 3/4 pound of black patent, a pound of chocolate, and half a pound of carapils. In addition to that, a pound of flaked malt, and true to the founding fathers, a pound of grits. Later on we're going to be adding other adjuncts like molasses and then our hops. But in addition to that, we also have a pound and a quarter of roasted barley, well actually barley roasting in the oven, just enough to give it a nutty flavor. Okay, once the water is added to the grain, you're going to have to let it stabilize for a moment. Be careful, do not add hot water or cold water because you think it's too hot or too cold to try to get your temperature. Here it's holding at 151.8. I'd like it a little higher, but I want to make sure it's stabilized before I add anything else and mix it in. It's easier to put water in than it is to take it out. If you need to raise it, just put hot water in. If you do need to lower it, a little bit of cool water, probably hot tap water would be the way to lower it down. But we're doing a single step infusion, so we just want to take it up to 155 as quick as possible. Okay, so when you get the grains going, give it a good stir, and you'll see the grains rolling around. Make sure everything is wet. You don't wind up in any dry clumps. Like I said before, I add the water a little bit at a time for temperature, but one of the dangers is that not everything gets the water. You just need to be particularly careful. And at this point, we should have reached our strike temperature. And once we do, we put the top on, and we can leave it for 60 minutes. I can come back later on, do a couple of tests with my spigot. Still rising. And once again, my strike temperature is 154, so I may need to add a little bit more hot water. When the porter style came to the United States, they took a basic London porter and changed it. They had basically described it as being made of low malts and high malts, the low malts being pale or pilsner or whatever they can get a hold of that wasn't really roasted, but it was malted and dried and then crushed. The high malts would be black patent, chocolate. I'm not too sure what they called them back then, but they were considered roastier and gave the chocolate and roasty flavors that you would have in here. But they didn't have a whole lot of malts. It was very, very expensive. So they ignored the molasses tax and added molasses to everything. The original recipe added gallons of molasses. I believe this original one had 1.5 gallons per 5 gallons of beer, which most people today would not be able to stomach. They also used corn to offset the lack of grains that they had, so that's why my recipe has about a pound of flaked corn in addition to molasses, but I did step that back for modern tastes. When home brewing, it's a good idea to have a couple of books on hand. Any book worth its salt would have charts, flavor profiles, beer profiles, recipes, and possibly a backstory. It makes a good read. This one is pretty much the original. It goes through the complete process from start to beginning, has a couple of recipes in it. Most of them are extract. There are a few all grain. These got it split into sections. This one has a couple of clones. I have not seen it on the market in about 15 years, but it's one of my favorites. In addition, it has some foods. This one is mine. It's where I got a modified version of the recipe I'm making today. Has a number of different recipes, charts, diagrams, backstories, flavor profiles, hop profiles, things like that. First iodine test is not going to be a great shocker, but I like to get a baseline. Trying to keep out of the shade here. You see how it's all black? I'll try that again with a little bit more light. All of that black is starch. Will soon be broken down by the enzymes alpha amylase and beta amylase, making our sugars. Some are fermentable, some are not. The ones that are fermentable will make alcohol. The ones that are not will give us flavor and all that yumminess that'll go with a nice George Washington style porter. Okay, halfway point starch test. There's mostly red, but there's some flecks of black. Do it on the edge, you can see a little bit better. And it's only been about 25 to 30 minutes of mashing. We should be done shortly. Yep, things are going along well. Okay, last protein, well actually last starch test. Everything appears to be perfect. I don't see anything but red swirls. Anything that we can't see will be broken down during sparging and knockoff, but I'd say we are done. Before I start sparging, I'm going to go against convention and tradition and try a little something different. Decoction method is often used for German types of beer. However, in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my temperature and raise it from 154 up to about 168, knocking off any enzyme reactions. What I did is I pulled off 1/3 of a 50-50 mixture of grains and liquid. I can do that with a measuring cup, very large, like quart size. Pull it off, make sure it's 50-50, put it on to boil. When I put it back in, it'll take everything and raise it up to my last strike temperature, knocking off all enzyme reactions. The reason why I'm trying this, even though it's against style, I want to have a nice malty finish when I'm done with all of this, and I want to make sure that all enzyme activity is ceased. And I don't want to have any of that maltiness hidden by the molasses or any other off flavors that might be produced by the yeast. Here the malt's on stage, whereas the Trappist, the yeast would be on the stage. Once the grains were boiled and the liquid with it was boiled and put back in, the temperature was raised to 168. Anything that was not converted is pretty much done at this point. We're almost ready to sparge as soon as we lock the grain bed. The grain bed is kind of a sponge made up of grains and husks, little particulates and things like that. Well, I want to pour off liquid and keep pouring it back in until it gets packed up at the top. Once that's done, it'll be an efficient filter, getting off all of the stuff. And the way I can tell is when it runs through a little clear. See, now it's kind of brownish, but pretty soon it will run almost to black, and that's when I can start the sparge. During sparging, it's very important to make sure that the water level on the top does not dip below the grain bed. You want to leave about 1 inch of water on the top, which we have about 2 inches. So I'll slow off the sparging just a little bit. That way we don't dilute it too much, but if it goes below the grain bed, the whole thing will lock, probably get stuck, and we have to do the whole thing all over again. Almost done sparging. What I did is I pulled off about 5 gallons so far, and I already put it on to boil. But normally what I do is I take a little bit of headspace from that and put it into another bucket, so that way I don't end up with a whole lot of overflow or have to pour water in at the very end and dilute everything. I like to keep things as pure as possible. Okay, it's almost come to a rolling boil. At this point you can see a foam building on the top. This is our protein break. It will boil over once it reaches that 212 degree mark. So don't leave it unattended or cover it up on your stove, unless of course you want to do a whole lot of work. Now once you're mashed, you take a look, you can see all the little flour pieces and husks left behind. If you want to do something with this stuff, rather than just throw it out, it makes great mulch. You can put it in a mulch bed or something along those lines, compost bin. If you're a hunter, if you mix it with a little bit of peanut butter and throw it in the backyard, it makes excellent bait, if that's your thing. Once it's at a rolling boil, we're going to add our Willamette hops, 1 ounce. Then we're going to pretty much leave it, keep an eye on it. Oh, there goes that break. If that happens, turn the heat off for a moment, let things settle, stir it up. And then turn the heat back on. At this point, you should leave it uncovered. When it is covered, it boils more rapidly. We want a little bit of moisture loss. We have about 6 gallons of liquid. We want to take it down to about 5.5. A little more is okay, but we're going to lose some through evaporation, which is just fine. About 2 minutes before the end of our boil, we're going to add another set of hops, and that'll be our Fuggles. That's a nice spicy aroma hops. It's not going to impart too much flavor. The Willamette will be just for the bitterness to offset all of the sugar and sweetness that we have in it. About 15 minutes towards the end of the boil, add Irish moss, 1 teaspoon. What that does is it attracts any sediment, helps it fall to the bottom, and we're going to get a big spin on this. So when we start taking the liquid off, any of the heavy sediment that we might have missed during the sparging will settle to the bottom. So we just rack it off of that and leave the sludge behind. This is easier than cooling it off and then racking it again. You have less of a chance of any contaminants. Alright, we have about 10 minutes before the end of the boil. I'm adding the rest of the molasses. When you pick molasses for this, a lot of recipes call for only 4 ounces. This one I'm using 12 ounces, but make sure, absolutely make sure it says unsulfured. You don't want any sulfur or any other chemicals in there. That'll inhibit fermentation. Got 2 minutes before the end of the boil. Our last helping of hops is going to be the Fuggles. Nice spicy aroma, 1 ounce. Not going to impart any flavor or bitterness. This is only for aroma. And that'll help overcome some of the aromas from the molasses and balance nicely with the malt. And everything will come together nicely. Keep this in for 2 minutes. When it's done, rack it off. Before I do that, I'll get that stir going on in it again. Rack it off into a clean fermenter. They sell wort chillers and things like that online and in brew stores. I just keep it in my fermenter for a couple hours. Everything is sanitized and clean, and I'll use a bucket without an airlock on it initially. That way I don't have to worry about it being contaminated. Okay, with your primary filled with the hot wort, your task is to let it sit for a few hours until it cools. They say less than 80 degrees before you pitch. Try to pitch below 70, otherwise your yeast will suffer or get kind of funky. Attach a lid without an airlock. If it had an airlock, it would suck in all of the moisture that would be from your airlock. And tamp it down. Let it sit. It will make noise. The lid may buckle. It will make noise, hissing and all of that stuff. Don't be afraid. In the morning it'll be concave and you can go ahead and pitch your yeast. You can start your yeast with a little bit of yeast starter or hydrate it in water. A little bit of boiled Malta-Goya would be perfect. If you liked this tutorial on YouTube, please let me know with some positive comments. If you really like the recipe or you want to read more, this is a copy of my book that's out. It's available on Amazon, through CreateSpace, many online bookstores. If you didn't like any of this, then don't mention it to anybody and it'll be our little secret. Thank you. Have a good day.